In a webinar, a title slide appears with a photo of a bearded man carrying a curly-haired boy on his back while exchanging smiles with a dark-haired woman and the young girl in her arms. Youth at Risk of Homelessness, YAHR, YARH, Lighthouse Youth and Family Services, Watch Me Rise, March 30, 2021. Welcome. We are glad that you are here. We will begin shortly. Child Welfare Information Gateway, Children's Bureau. Brunette Jennifer Vidrine appears in a small chat window at the top right of the screen.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Jen Vidrine. I'm with Child Welfare Information Gateway, which is the information service of the Children's Bureau. For those who are joining us for the first time, welcome. For those who have joined another webinar in this series, welcome back. This is our third in the Youth at Risk of Homelessness grantee webinar series. And today we will be featuring the Lighthouse Youth and Family Services Watch Me Rise project. So before we jump into today's presentation, we are going to go over just a couple of housekeeping items. So for a reminder for all folks, everyone is automatically going to be muted throughout the presentation. If you have a question about the topics that are being discussed, or that you want to ask one of the panelists and presenters, please feel free to use the Q&A feature in Zoom. So that is going to be in your toolbar at the bottom of the screen. So our panelists will either be able to answer you directly or answer your question for the full audience today, but use that option throughout the presentation as questions come up. Additionally, everyone who attends today will be sent today's PowerPoint presentation, as well as a couple of resources that the grantee has selected. And we'll also talk about a YARH subscription list at the end of this webinar today, where you can sign up to make sure that you're staying up to date as new content and material becomes available. All right, so let's go ahead and move in. So I am going to turn things over to Jan Schaefer. She is the Director of Division of Program Innovation at the Children's Bureau. She's going to talk about the discretionary grants program at the Children's Bureau and give a little bit more information on the YARH grant. Jan?
Blonde Jan Schaefer.
Thank you, Jen. I'm really delighted to be able to be with you today and introduce this webinar. And I wanted to start by thanking Catherine Heath for her remarkable leadership in all of the youth programs that we implement at the Bureau. The Children's Bureau is the oldest child and youth serving agency in the federal government. We're over 100 years old, and we have a budget of over $10 billion. The large majority of that money is distributed to states through formula grants in order to support their implementation of their child welfare programs. But a small portion of the money is available to us to support competitive discretionary grants for which we can identify funding priorities and create innovations in many cases. Those grants go to states, tribes, and territories, to community-based organizations, both for-profit and nonprofit. It's often because of this innovative work that child welfare practice is actually changed in the field due to the implementation of lessons learned or evidence built from these programs. We know that youth and young adults with a history of child welfare involvement face many challenges as they transition to adulthood, including risk of homelessness. The YARH, or Youth at Risk of Homelessness grant program, is unique in a number of ways. There are other federal programs that support grants to prevent homelessness, but the Children's Bureau program is the only one that focuses on youth with child welfare involvement. It's also unique in its phased approach. We planned a three-phase approach to this grant program in order to provide the grantees enough time to plan, to stabilize their programs, and then move toward rigorous evaluation. So phase one consisted of planning and exploration. We funded 18 grants in that phase. And those grantees competitively applied for an implementation phase. 6 grantees went into implementation, which involves testing their intervention, implementing the programs, and conducting some formative evaluation to determine if they were ready to go into rigorous evaluation. And then the third phase is rigorous or summative evaluation. Throughout all the phases of the project, grantees continued to refine their approaches and work to create visibility of their work in order to inform the field. To that end, today's webinar is going to focus on phase 2, where you'll hear about lessons learned from Lighthouse Youth Services. I wanted to note that these webinars have generated a lot of interest in the field for these programs. And just wanted to note for you that until we complete rigorous evaluation, at the current time, we don't have plans to forecast new grant awards at this time. As I turn it over to Vicki, just want to say how proud we are of the work that they've accomplished, how excited we are about their results. And I want to acknowledge the hard work and dedication that's gone into your project's success. So thank you, and I'll turn it over to Vicki.
Blonde Victoria Ackman.
Thank you, Jan. I appreciate that. Welcome, everyone. We would like to thank the Children's Bureau and OPRE for the opportunity to present our project today. And also many thanks to Team Mathematica for all of their assistance throughout our YARH project. Next slide, please.
Watch Me Rise, a service model for homeless youth with a child welfare history.
Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Vicki Ackman. I'm the Service Area President at Lighthouse Youth and Family Services. I am also currently the Project Director for Watch Me Rise. With me today is Sherry Halchin, who is a Service Area Supervisor and Operations Manager during Watch Me Rise. Robin Lindquist Grants is from the University of Cincinnati Institute for Policy Research and is also here today. She and Kim Downing served as co-lead evaluators throughout the entire Watch Me Rise project. Next slide, please.
Today's agenda.
Thank you. So for our agenda today, we are going to share a brief history of YARH and the activities that are currently taking place. We will also provide an overview of the Watch Me Rise service model and highlight some key findings of the evaluation. Although you are more than welcome to post questions anytime in the Q&A box, we will leave a little time at the end to answer questions as well as provide additional resources related to our project. Next slide,
Part
please.
1, the history of YARH, current YARH activities.
We know that many of you have participated in previous YARH webinars and may have already heard about the history of YARH. For today's participants who have not heard about the history, we're going to provide just a brief overview. Next slide, please.
A bulleted list.
So about YARH, the Children's Bureau started a multi-phase grant program in 2013 to build evidence on what works in preventing homelessness among youth and adults, young adults with previous involvement in the child welfare system. The grant program and related contracts is known as YARH. Our community was awarded a planning contract in 2013, which is YARH Phase 1, and then an implementation grant in 2015, which is YARH 2. Locally, our YARH program is known as Watch Me Rise. Okay, next slide, please.
Motivation for YARH.
And so what is our motivation for YARH? Approximately 23,000 youth age out of child welfare systems every year. States have the option to extend services up until foster care until age 21 and services up to age 23. But we know that there is a great disparity in the outcomes of youth exiting from foster care. While some young adults transition successfully into adulthood, there are those who are in additional risk of homelessness, especially if the youth have experienced multiple placements in their lifetime, if they've lived in group homes, or if they ran away from the foster care system. According to the National Youth in Transition Database, 19% of youth formerly in foster care were homeless within the past 2 years. Additionally, 36% of homeless youth report having been in foster care at least once in their lifetime. As we see in the slide, there are a huge range of other outcomes that need to be addressed for youth exiting from foster care. The purpose of YARH is to change the relationships of responsibility that child welfare agencies have in preventing homelessness. Robin is now going to talk about how YARH has helped us understand how to help youth and young adults with child welfare experiences. Robin?
Brown-haired Robin Lindquist grants.
Okay, great. Thanks, Vicki.
YARH goals.
So YARH grantees and the contractor Mathematica accomplished many things as part of YARH. However, there were two clearly stated goals. First, develop comprehensive service models to prevent youth and young adult homelessness. And two, test the comprehensive service models to build evidence to support them. Next slide, please.
Focal populations and outcomes.
So there are 3 focal populations in YARH. The first one being adolescents who enter foster care between the ages of 14 and 17. The second population is young adults aging out of foster care. And the third population is homeless youth and young adults with foster care histories up to age 21. Within Watch Me Rise, we focused on the third population, which is the homeless young adults with foster care histories. If you look here under the outcomes section, YARH focused on 4 critical outcomes identified in the United States Interagency Council on Homelessness Youth Framework. And these include housing, permanent connections, education and employment, and a social emotional well-being. Next slide.
YARH activities grantees.
So this slide shows you a bit about what Jan was talking about in the beginning, about kind of how the evidence building was conducted in the 3 phases of YARH. So in phase 1, we really focused on learning more about youth and young adults at risk of homelessness in our communities. And then we also started designing comprehensive service models that would address what youth needed in each of our individual communities. And then in YARH 2, we began to implement and test our models. ACF and Mathematica helped us develop theory of change and logic model so that we could then further develop it. We did a series of small usability tests. We implemented continuous quality improvement to really tracked fidelity to our intervention during this time. We were able to develop a detailed manual for Watch Me Rise, and then we also conducted a formative evaluation. So now we're into YARH 3, where we're continuing to build and share evidence of our comprehensive services models. There's no longer an ACF grant supporting the work, but rather each site entered into a memorandum of understanding with Mathematica to receive funds to support the YARH 3 work. Next slide.
YARH evidence building path.
So this just shows you quickly the evidence building path in more detail. Long story short, this takes a lot of time. We started off in the box on the left and the right, designing our comprehensive models, and then we worked our way up the path to produce strong evidence. So now we're in YARH 3, where we're producing evidence of impacts. And while we're not going to be the focus of the YARH 3 federally led evaluation, one of the YARH sites is going to be part of that evaluation. Next slide.
How will we continue to learn? Watch for new YARH products.
How will the field continue to learn from YARH? ACF and Mathematica plan to continue to share findings and lessons learned from the YARH work. And the products on this slide here are planned, so you should continue to watch out for them on the OPRE website. Next slide.
Part 2, Watch Me Rise WMR service model.
Okay, so I'm going to send it back to Vicki, who can introduce Watch Me Rise to you. This name actually was developed by members of our Lighthouse Youth Advisory Council. The young people on the council actually contribute to a number of projects, especially related to child welfare and homelessness initiatives. And as you can imagine, their work on this project was extremely important. Okay, Vicki.
Victoria Ackman.
Thanks, Robin. Next slide, please.
Local context.
Okay, so just to give a little bit of local context about Lighthouse. Lighthouse Youth and Family Services is in Hamilton County, Ohio, which is home to the city of Cincinnati. Although this is our main headquarters, we are situated in a tri-state area, which means we serve youth from all around the region, especially on our youth homelessness and street outreach program. During YARH 1, we found that 26% of youth served by the county's homeless system in 2014 self-reported a child welfare history. Data from the county's homeless management information system and child welfare systems from 2010 to 2015 also indicated that 51% of the county's youth with a child welfare history were homeless at least once since emancipating from care. In addition to this data, the city of Cincinnati has routinely been among the 10 highest child poverty rates in larger American cities in the past decade. At the time of our assessment, there were limited local housing options for emerging adults, and there were increases in child welfare custody cases from the opioid epidemic. We found that youth in our region needed a comprehensive service model that would help them during their immediate housing crisis, as well as prepare them for long-term stability. Next slide, please.
Sheakley Center for Youth.
Lighthouse was uniquely situated to serve YARH Population 3 homelessness youth with a foster care history. We have operated crisis services for runaway youth in a shelter for homeless youth since 2013. The pictures here on the slide show our Sheakley Center for Youth building that was completed in 2018. The Sheakley Center serves young adults ages 18 to 24. We have 13 shelter beds, 39 transitional living apartments, and a day program for youth. In addition to the youth, Lighthouse provides a wide array of services in which we can kind of provide a comprehensive set of services from mental health to foster care services to help the youth thrive. Next slide.
WMR theory of change assumptions.
Lighthouse's ongoing work with child welfare involved youth and youth experiencing homelessness is grounded in positive youth development. We know that youth are resilient and capable, especially when they are provided with stable supports and resources to help them during their transition into adulthood. We also knew from interviews conducted with youth during YARH 1 that youth with a child welfare history were skeptical of the service systems, but they were willing to engage in services that tailored to their unique needs. They wanted to really establish connections with formal and natural supports who can provide hands-on learning and help them navigate through the community resources. They also wanted to work with peers who they could relate to that had the same experiences. I am now going to let Sherry describe how we used our experience and information obtained during YARH 1 to development and implement Watch Me Rise. Sherry?
Goal of WMR service model. Jen's chat window pops up as Vicki Ackman speaks.
Sherry, you are on mute.
Next, Blonde Cherie Houchin.
Of course I was, sorry. Thank you, Vicki, sorry. In developing our theory of change and logic model for Watch Me Rise, it was clear that what we were aiming to do was help youth develop a sense of connected autonomy. And we were doing this to prevent reoccurring homelessness. Connected autonomy is a term that has been used to describe an objective of the youth's development where every youth's right to self-determination is valued while relationships and social connections that support the youth's goals are achievement and also fostered. The goal of Watch Me Rise was to foster connected autonomy by helping each youth build and maintain relationships, resources, and protective factors so that they could serve as an ongoing safety net while the young person transitioned from homelessness to stable housing. Next slide.
WMR service model. High fidelity wraparound.
To achieve connected autonomy, Watch Me Rise was based on the high fidelity wraparound model. Wraparound puts the clients at the center of their foster care, at the center of their care. It is not case management. It is an individualized and youth-driven care coordination process that connects youth with existing community resources. With the help of a facilitator, the youth builds a diverse team that includes system supports, a peer support specialist, and natural supports to help them identify their own individualized needs and goals. The team also helps the youth with strategies for achieving those goals. Before we talk about the details of Watch Me Rise, it is helpful to understand the typical parts of the youth team in Watch Me Rise. Next slide.
WMR team.
The youth teams includes a mix of internal program staff and external supports. First, the facilitator is the primary point of contact and is responsible for helping the youth move through the 4 phases of wraparound. They are also the youth's first point to connect during the recruitment, and their ability to connect with the youth and navigate the phases and wraparound is critical. The facilitator also helps the youth develop and coordinate their team of formal and natural supports. Formal supports include individuals who work with the youth in their professional capacities, such as case managers, therapists, and school personnel. Natural supports include individuals who the youth know more informally, such as family members, friends, and mentors. The inclusion of natural support is in this structure and facilitated in the environment is the key component of the wraparound process and is necessary for the youth's sustained success. At least 51% of the youth team should be comprised of natural supports. In Watch Me Rise, we also incorporated a youth support advocate. Peer supports may build the resiliency of the youth involved in wraparound, but descriptions about how they can be incorporated in the process have been limited. It is important to us and the youth that we talk to in YARH 1 that this role be incorporated into the service model. Therefore, it was established as a staff position within Lighthouse, and our next slides show the roles and the responsibilities of the facilitator and the youth advocate varied and intersected. Next slide.
WMR facilitator in action.
As I mentioned, the facilitator is the primary contact of the program and helps the youth move through the program. During team meetings, the facilitator seeks to enhance the relationship between the team members so everyone learns new skills about communication, participation, and the importance of supported relationships. The goal is to build relationships, access to resources, and protective factors to serve as an ongoing safety net. The items on the right of your screen show what is needed for the facilitator to be successful. Caseloads need to be limited to 12 to 16 youth so that the adequate time can be given to the comprehensive services. A flexible schedule is important to the youth who are juggling work and/or school and managing multiple challenges. Facilitators do a lot of driving, so a car insurance, and a driver's license is key. Facilitators must embody youth voice and choice philosophy. For Watch Me Rise to be successful, it must be youth-driven. It may be difficult for a clinically trained staff member to adapt to the philosophies, approach, and documentation of Watch Me Rise. We found that facilitators who have a clinical background can struggle with focusing on strengths and unmet needs rather than diagnosing the youth. Next slide, please.
Youth support advocate in action.
The youth support advocate is like a peer support in other services. They are a source of supportive base on shared life experiences such as child welfare and/or homeless history, and an advocate for the youth. They also help the youth learn to advocate for themselves and prepare them to drive for the team meetings. They have helped prepare the youth to participate in the agency and system leadership opportunities. The items on the right of the screen are the elements that we found essential to the role. Peers did not necessarily mean that the person had to be the same age. We found that older individuals who have experienced child welfare or homelessness were better suited for the role. Younger peers often did not have a valid driver's license, car insurance, or their own vehicle, and all of these are needed for the position. Conversations with the Lighthouse Youth Advisory Council members also showed that the young adults did not think they had enough experience to work in a professional setting, helping youth through their adversities and instabilities that they may be experiencing themselves. So we revised the position and expand the recruitment to older individuals who have experienced trauma, but had time to gain perspective and healing. Youth who enrolled in Watch Me Rise were not automatically assigned a youth support advocate because it was important to give the facilitator time to build a relationship with the youth first. Also, it is important that youth was given a choice on whether they wanted to add a youth support advocate or not to build with their team. We found that the youth were more likely to add the youth support advocate if they became familiar with the person during wraparound activities. For example, note-taking during visual timeline was being developed. This strategy allowed for a natural relationship to happen. The youth advocate should be a full-time position. This prevents them from having to work more than one job and making them available to be flexible schedules and the needs of the youth. Full-time employment also provides health insurance and other benefits so that the emerging leaders can be, so the emerging leaders with professional fields. It also helps prevent staff turnover. Starting salaries with youth support advocates should be like salaries for entry-level direct support workers. Wages should ensure that the basic needs were met so the financial stress does not hinder the process of advocating for the youth. It is important for the facilitator to give the room for the youth support advocate to engage the youth. Now that we have shared the basics of Watch Me Rise, we want to talk a little bit about how the youth gets involved in the program. As many of you know, engaging the youth, next slide.
WMR enrollment steps.
As many of you know, engaging youth can be one of the most challenging aspects of the service delivery, but it can also be the most rewarding, especially to the youth who is initially hesitant has become one of our greatest testimonies. We know all the importance of building trust and the rapport with the youth, but like I always say, it begins at hello. We spent a lot of time testing and defining our different processes and getting youth enrolled into Watch Me Rise. We had to manage our reluctance. We had to manage the youth's reluctancy and involvement. We had to manage the youth's reluctance to become involved into the program and to connect with them within 30 days of coming into the shelter. We had to get them at the front door that we could do our best to service them. Step 1, an introduction meeting needed to occur within 24 to 72 hours. The screening was based off the youth shelter's intake records. We found it was best for the facilitator who would be working with the youth to meet them at the door. Step 2, we invited the youth to participate, but also empowered them to take time to decide. We offered a learn more option and allowed the youth to still be there, to still be in the driver's seat. Often, I would say that no means not right now. We would use flexible funds to discuss the youth's concerns before enrolling. We continued to meet with the youth to discuss their questions and concerns until they decided that sometimes it even occurred after they had left the shelter. We found that it was important to leave the shelter and to have more of a natural setting to engage the youth.
4 phases of wraparound in WMR, 6 to 18 months.
Next slide, please. This slide shows the 4 phases of high fidelity wraparound process in Watch Me Rise. We marked in bold the key components to wraparound that the structure of the process. A lot happens in the beginning of phase 1. This phase is important because it sets the stage for the remaining process. It is also important that we're going to discuss it in more detail because of what we have learned when working in this population. Because the process is individualized to meet the youth needs and to meet the unique needs and goals, this length times varies, but typically it's 6 to 18 months. It is important to be given enough time in each phase because if you try to make shortcuts, you're going to have to come back and start over, especially in phase 1. If the youth goes beyond 18 months, then you're not doing wraparound. So what is the whole purpose of this process? It is designed to help the youth make progress towards their goals in order to increase a sense of self-efficacy and the ability to manage in the transition of adulthood. The process should facilitate and access the system's resources to improve youth functioning in a variety of domains in order to prevent future homelessness. Initially, the youth may access more support systems. However, as the individual goals are met with the help of natural supports, the youth reliance on the support team should decrease over time. A lot has been written about wraparound, so we provided a brief overview. Here is a list of resources at the end. There is at least a list of a few resources at the end of the presentation to help you find more information.
Phase 1, lessons learned.
In the next slide, Robin is going to share in the next slide, Robin is going to share with all of you some of our key learnings from implementing wraparound with the homeless young adult and child welfare history. Back to you, Robin.
Victoria Ackman.
Sherry, there's a question, if you could answer that first, please. One of the questions was, what disqualifies youth from participating in the program?
Sherry.
So The youth had to be between the ages of 18 and 21 years old with a self-reported history of foster care. So we did not actually go back and check child welfare records. We only had access to Ohio child welfare records, and we actually had youth from all over the country who ended up in our shelter with a child health welfare history. We even had one young man who was in an orphanage in Russia. So it was a self-reported history of child welfare. Other than that, you were not eligible.
Victoria.
Thank you.
Robin Lindquist grants. Phase 1 lessons learned.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Vicki. I was going to punt that to her as well. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about phase 1. You know, Sherry touched on the trust and rapport that was initiated at enrollment, and that actually really was important to carry over into phase 1. As you can imagine, developing this with youth who are experiencing homelessness is really important, and it can also take a long time given their experiences. So we really wanted to emphasize this aspect of the work for you today. So in traditional wraparound, this phase takes approximately 2 to 3 weeks, but in Watch Me Rise, we expanded that out to 8 to 10 weeks since youth were dealing with additional housing instability. And also this gave time to build that relationship with the facilitator. So this situation with these young people is quite different than I think where you often see wraparound used with a caregiver who is driving the process, and the youth it's guided by the youth, but they're a little bit along for the ride. As Sherry mentioned, this was really critical for Watch Me Rise to be youth driven, given the nature of the population. So giving the time at the beginning to build that relationship, to build the trust with the facilitator so the youth felt confident in them, and then also for the youth to develop trust with themselves and the ability to drive their own plan. So down to point 2 here, the initial engagement meeting was an important kickoff to the individualized process. It was really helpful to kind of like enrollment, to get out of that formal office environment or even actually the youth's home, and to conduct the engagement meeting out at a restaurant of the youth's own choosing. And this kind of just helped really encourage them to relax, have an informal conversation, and allow that conversation to move at the youth's own pace. The support funds or flexible funds were really important part of this phase of the project, and Sherry had also mentioned them as part of enrollment. This allowed for there to be more flexibility in order to really meet the youth where they are. So point 3, initial attempts to engage natural and formal supports in the strengths, needs, and culture discovery interviews can be challenging, and that you see listed here in on the phase 1 training. Even though it's challenging, the facilitator should continue to reach out to these individuals, even if they decline an interview, because they may become important natural supports on the youth team later in the process. And we should also never assume that the youth doesn't have family that is willing to engage in the process. So one of the stories to come out of Watch Me Rise was a young person who had gone missing from a group home 2 years earlier and was actually on the National Missing and Exploited Children's list. And when he came into Watch Me Rise, stated that he believed his father had passed away. Come to find out, the Watch Me Rise facilitator did a little digging, found voter records. Dad was actually alive, found out that dad and all of his family also thought the youth had passed away because he was on that list. So Watch Me Rise was able in phase 1 to really connect the youth with his father and their family, and now the young person is actually living with the grandmother. So that extra effort in phase 1 really set the stage for how that youth was going to be able to progress through the rest of the Watch Me Rise phases. So moving down now to talk about staff utilization and productivity, there really has to be time to create and conduct the phase 1 activities. The hours spent during this time, as I said, are really crucial to building the youth team, developing their plan of care. And if there's insufficient utilization allowances for these activities, staff may use shortcuts, and because they feel like they need to focus on other billable services. So this can really affect youth engagement and create the need to repeat phase 1 activities later, which kind of sets everybody behind. So it's pretty important to consider that in this. And then lastly, we wanted to note the importance of the trauma-informed care, which I'm going to bring up here in a bit, because it can greatly benefit the activities in this phase. Next slide, Jen.
Initial engagement is key.
So initial engagement is the cornerstone to sustaining youth engagement throughout the entire program. So this is why we're highlighting it today in this slide. And the next slide, you're going to see it. In our evaluation, of course, we measured outcomes, but we also conducted interviews and focus groups with youth that were involved in the program and also with staff. And through the evaluation, we found that in addition to trust and rapport, youth really want to see early success to feel like the program is worth their effort. So we developed this set of recommendations based on that, and recommend that they occur early in the process in order to foster that initial engagement to kind of turn into sustained engagement. So the first point here is convening the first Watch Me Rise team meeting with formal supports within 15 to 30 days of enrollment. Formal supports are usually pretty easy to access. Natural supports might take more time, so you can at least pull together the formal supports initially. Also, incorporate further building of the youth team into their first plan of care goal, right? So you're building on that goal, you're getting that momentum to emphasize the importance of supportive connections as part of the Watch Me Rise process. And then building to kind of keep that momentum, you really want to update that plan of care within the first 45 days to keep things moving for the young person. And then one thing we wanted to note is that you should always be prepared to assign a different facilitator. We all connect and gravitate towards different people. We're all like that. So lack of a youth's engagement or maybe repeated enrollments may suggest that the facilitator just wasn't a good fit, and maybe there's somebody else who will fit better. Next slide.
Transition out of WMR.
So initial and sustained engagement, should lead the youth through the program and a successful transition out of the program. We kind of spent the first part of the presentation talking about the front door, but the back door is also just as important. So this slide shows you the indicators and measures that we set for knowing when a youth is ready to transition out of Watch Me Rise. The focus on transition planning is transparent and ongoing. In fact, the concept is introduced very early in phase 1 and continues as the plan of care progresses. So as youth engage, what you see here is that when youth engage more with their supports and other resources, they actually start to contact the facilitator less frequently. So that's a good sign. And then the team meetings also become shorter and more focused on the youth's achievements rather than their unmet needs. Sherry, I'm going to have you talk a little bit about graduation.
Robin takes a sip of water. Cherie Houchin's chat window appears.
Sorry. Thank you. Thanks, Robin. So graduation is just as important as the whole process. And as we talked about before, short-term wins are important, but the long-term wins are just as important. So graduation also, the whole graduation plan starts at hello. So what are we going to do once we graduate? Graduation from Watch Me Rise should be treated as an important milestone and the opportunity for the team to celebrate with the youth. The youth and the facilitator develop a guest list together and locate in a location selected by the youth, which is typically a restaurant. For some reason, in most places, it's usually a buffet. Food costs are covered up to $15 a person, including a tax and the tip. And the facilitator usually provides a card and a graduation gift related to the client's personal interest. Some examples are we've bought pictures for the home, we paid for driving lessons. The young man that Robin mentioned earlier, we actually bought him a laptop because he was going to Job Corps and other gifts that would impact their personal needs. The cost of the gift depends on how much support funds were used during the program. So the flexible funds are important, but the cost of the gift is we have to also stay within that. We are also followed up with the youth after graduation. That's really an important part of wraparound, is to follow up after the services have ended. So the youth support advocate or the facilitators should follow up within 30 days of their exit. This is done in person or over the phone, whichever best fits for the young person. And if the plans and if the transition plan and existing supports are not enough and the youth needed to return to Watch Me Rise, you should be able to re-enroll them. Next slide.
Part 3, Key Evaluation Findings. Robin Lindquist grants.
Okay. And I see a question here I want to address before we move on. If a youth decides to stop in the middle of the process, do they have the opportunity to re-enter? Absolutely. And Sherry, maybe you can touch on that a little bit more, how much you saw that.
Sherry Houchin.
So we actually had a process in place that if the youth, we gave them a window of opportunity to re-enroll. So if we didn't actually close them out, because no means not right now. And so we were not meeting an unmet need if the youth had decided to stop the process. So we would leave them open for a period of 90 days. However, if they did not re-engage within 90 days, they would have to re-enroll by coming back in through the shelter. But we did leave that open and gave them the opportunity to return.
Robin Lindquist grants.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we've told you a little bit, we've given you kind of the quick and dirty version of Watch Me Rise here, the brief highlights. So you might be asking, well, does this actually really work at Youth at Risk of Homelessness? So I want to briefly share some of the evaluation findings.
Linking youth engagement to outcome.
So to kind of ground the evaluation, I want to think about this youth engagement piece. So we know many of you are familiar with or have used wraparound, and we know it's been used with youth experiencing homelessness, but that usage has been somewhat limited in the field. And there has even been less studied about its use with former foster youth experiencing homelessness. So that's what we really focused our session on today with some of the Watch Me Rise components that we've been talking about. So as I said, we've really focused on the youth engagement piece because it seemed like regardless of what we examined in our initial testing of the service model, it always came back to youth engagement, always. So we developed this pathway to really kind of conceptualize how does engagement get us to outcomes in Watch Me Rise. So you'll notice that it really kind of emphasizes that it begins at hello principle that Sherry mentioned here at the bottom step here with enrollment. And then that moves up the steps into the youth outcomes that we hope to see.
Evaluation
Next
period,
slide.
October 1, 2017 to December 31, 2019.
So the evaluation of Watch Me Rise lasted just over 2 years.
Total enrollment,
During
87
that time,
youth.
We used a series of questionnaires to help us measure outcomes in 5 domains, and these included housing stability, social connectedness, social emotional functioning, transition to adulthood, and education and employment. Out of the 10 outcomes measured across these 5 domains, 8 were met at least somewhat. So the next few slides are going to show you our results within the first 6 months of youth enrolling in the program.
6 months after enrolling in WMR, youth demonstrated improvement.
So first, we really want to highlight the outcome most associated with the purpose of this grant, youth experiencing homelessness.
Housing stability.
Since our project was really focused on YARH Population 3, homeless young adults with a foster care history, we aim to prevent recurring homelessness. So as you can see here, and you can imagine, we're pretty pleased to report that 92% of all the youth who entered Watch Me Rise through the youth shelter had no additional shelter stays 6 months after they enrolled in Watch Me Rise. We also saw tremendous improvement in the number of living situations. So if you look here at intake or baseline, about 3/4 of the youth had experienced 3 or more living situations in the previous 6 months. But then when we looked at that again, in the 6-month follow-up period, this was reversed with 3/4 of youth having experienced only 1 to 2 living situations. And really among those youth with 2 situations, that included that original shelter stay that got me into Watch Me Rise. So really outside of that shelter stay, they only had 1 additional living situation. So in light of that positive finding, we do still want to stress that Watch Me Rise is not a housing intervention. That is not its exact intention. Separate case management services are provided to youth that are residing in the youth shelter in order to help them locate housing. However, it's important that Watch Me Rise be integrated into those existing shelter services. So that's something to consider if you also are operating a shelter. Watch Me Rise played a vital role in being a housing advocate for youth, at making sure that their plans for housing were trauma informed and also focused on that long-term stability. So one example of this that Sherry has shared with me is a young man who was hesitant to move into an available apartment. Watch Me Rise kind of helped him voice his concerns to shelter staff and other housing folks that were trying to kind of get him into this apartment. He was hesitant because somebody he knew had been shot in that neighborhood, and that was a very traumatic experience for him. So in being able to voice that and expose that situation, they were able to actually locate other housing for him that made him feel much more comfortable and was actually going to probably provide much longer term stability in his housing situation.
Graphs charting the
Next
average
slide.
number of natural supports and social emotional functioning.
So regarding social connectedness, youth indicated a high average number of supports at baseline and 6 months. Now that said, when we measured the actual level of connectedness, it was pretty low at that intake and 6 month point. So even though youth were reporting a high number of supports, it didn't necessarily mean that they saw those people as reliable allies. It may also kind of reflect this social desirability response bias, so that maybe they felt compelled to report a high number of supports because they thought they would please the facilitator or something else. So that really makes measuring the actual strength of connections beyond the number really important. And then the pie chart on the right with the social emotional functioning, we actually measured that using the problem severity scale on the Ohio scales. And as you can see, about 8 out of 10 youth clinically improved or remained stable at a low level of problem severity. And given that high percentage of youth who remain stable, we didn't actually see a significant change, but it also means that a lot of young people were not getting worse. So, we take that as a win. Next slide.
Victoria.
Robin, I have some questions first.
Sure.
Okay. One was, how did you measure social connectedness?
Robin.
That was with the youth connection scale. And that is something that is used quite a bit in the child welfare field, or at least has been in recent years. We've been seeing a lot of use of that. And I think some of the other folks in the YARH grant used it as well.
Victoria.
Another question for you is, do you have plans to follow youth beyond the 6 month period to see if they continue to have no additional shelter stays?
Robin.
That is the magic question. We actually did follow youth. Our intention was to actually follow them for 18 months. And for some of the youth, we got there, of course, more youth, we got to the 12-month. Unfortunately, with this population and some of the timelines of the grant period, we saw a fair bit of attrition. So we didn't really meet our mark to be able to see them as far out as we would like to. And we're kind of digging in and writing some more about that because it is pretty tough. But it seems like the 6 months gave us at least the best numbers for understanding where we were trending to see what's going on with youth. But absolutely following them further out is.
Victoria.
Thank you. There's just one more question. Can you repeat how was youth engagement defined and measured?
Robin.
So youth engagement, so that was part of our process evaluation. So we didn't really necessarily measure that as an outcome, but we looked at the youth participation in planning scale. That is a part, you see that a lot in the wraparound literature. It's also often associated with the youth empowerment scale, mental health. So those often come together. So that looks at, were they involved in service planning? Did they feel like they were driving that plan? And then of course, we looked at a lot of administrative data about their actual, did they stay active in the program? If they became inactive, how often did that, or when did that happen? Which we found that's going to happen pretty early. If they're going to disengage, it's going to happen within like the first 60 days. So
Victoria.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Robin, transition to adulthood and education and employment.
So within the transition to adulthood domain on the left, we measured 3 outcomes: life domain functioning, hopefulness, and self-efficacy. And while the outcomes are promising, the largest effect we saw was within the life domain functioning. So that indicates youth had a more positive view of their ability to handle daily life from baseline to 6 months. And then as for education and employment, Watch Me Rise is an individualized service model. So youth may not always prioritize education and employment, especially when they're prioritizing trying to find housing for themselves. So this is partly why the sample sizes are low. But despite these issues, at least, within the small numbers we have here, we did see some modest gains in educational attainment and enrollment. And then we also saw some increases in youth being enrolled at least part-time. Next slide.
Part 4, Q&A and closing remarks.
So great, I'm glad people are asking questions. We're going to open it up for a few more questions. Maybe before we do that, why don't we go ahead and acknowledge some of the key partners that made Watch Me Rise possible. Thanks, Jen.
WMR key partners.
This project absolutely would not have been possible without the support provided by our child welfare system. And that included Hamilton County Job and Family Services and the Ohio Department of Job and Family Services. They provided organizational support and input throughout the entire project, and they were especially helpful in sharing administrative data for the evaluation. And then we'd also like to acknowledge many of the partners who assisted with the first phase of the project. They're listed here in the box. We're really fortunate to have a robust service system in Hamilton County, and all these folks believe in the power of collaboration. So it was pretty easy for them to join along.
A list of additional YARH-1 steering committee members.
So next slide, and we will, you can enter more questions into the Q&A, and let's see what else is in here.
On the next slide, quotes from WMR Youth include, "They listened to me. They heard my voice and made sure everyone else was hearing me as well. Nobody has ever asked what I wanted before. And if you don't know, they get you to the point where you can figure it out. I have more freedom with what I want."
Sherry, you might be able to answer this because of your ongoing work in the youth shelter. Somebody's talking about social isolation and regarding housing, pairing up youth according to gender identity, male, female. They're wondering, or middle and upper class individuals, basically, are those kinds of arrangements encouraged?
Cherie Houchin.
So High Fidelity Wraparound and Watch Me Rise was youth voice and choice. So we really listened to what the youth wanted and really tried to help foster some of these relationships. We were not focused on housing. We were part of the housing team. So if the shared housing model was something the youth wanted, we would have supported that in our plan. However, that was not our focus within the group. The focus is building natural supports and making sure that they had a sustainable support system once all your formal supports stepped out. What was the biggest surprise in Watch Me Rise? I always say that the youth who always seem to be the easiest at first are those who were the ones that usually disengage and that you really didn't see the most success. I would say that the biggest surprise that came out of Watch Me Rise is that the young people who have built relationships and those of us who are still here, part of the team that we hear back from are young people. Many have gone on to leadership roles and are continuing to participate in our Youth Advisory Council, and they continue to update us in their successes. We've had lots of success stories just even recently in the last couple of months. So I always say that maybe we're here to plant the seeds and not to watch the trees grow. However, it's really been really fun and exciting to watch some of those trees grow.
Victoria Ackman.
Sherry, there's another question. Looking back, what would you change about the process? Recommendations to others if interested in replicating this approach for this population.
Cherie.
So I became the operations manager and the supervisor in the middle of the implementation process. So there was just there were lots of things that we changed through the process. So there were lots of lessons learned, not knowing that we needed a policy until, something happened. Flexible funds. One of the things that I've always said was to get the young people out of the institutional setting into a more natural setting, a more organic setting. It was surprising how many young people had never, ever even been to McDonald's. However, not putting limits on what, food costs was going to be. I wish we would have had a little bit more marketing in the beginning. It was really hard for buy-in, and when you go into the steps of changes, one of them in the beginning is a sense of urgency and to have a buy-in. So it was really hard to have buy-in because we didn't really have the correct marketing to get those who we needed on the team sometimes within our own work. So a lot of the resistance came from not understanding what it is that you're actually do, because I'm coming in and saying to you, I'm not providing case management. And so in a case management world, what are you helping me to provide that you can help my outcomes? So marketing in the very beginning would have been more helpful to have some real solid literature of what it was that we were trying to accomplish.
Victoria.
Great, thank you. There is another question. What were some of the barriers and struggles that staff experienced while working with the clients during this process?
Cherie.
Well, the first is rapport. They don't trust us. So all of our youth had come from a history of foster care. I remember interviewing one of our young people, and she had been through 23 service providers. So how was I going to be different? So really having to show that this was something that was different and that this was going to be helpful in life. And again, I want to say, I know Colorado talked a lot about this in the last one, that those flexible funds were really helpful in having some openness to how we could really help those young people in the beginning. So also, again, the barrier of, I think this seems to be happening. A lot of the different work that I've done is just service integration. How do you get everybody who, especially those who are in billable service, to come to a meeting that there may be 3 or 4 different billable people there and they can't bill for their time. So how to get everybody into one table, because the process of wraparound is to bring everybody to one team and to have one conversation.
Victoria.
Great, thank you. Another question is, are youth not required to attend school as a participant of the Watch Me Rise program?
Cherie.
So no. Most of our youth were over the age of 18 in our YARH program, or all of our youth were over the age of 18 because we were working with youth who were already had emancipated or were on the verge of emancipating. So here in Ohio, we have foster care extended to 21. So if most of our youth who are already over the age of 18. But again, it's about youth voice and choice. And so education may have been on the forefront, but it may not have been our initial goal. So were no requirements to participate in Watch Me Rise, except to participate, to come to the meetings and to provide the information and to be active in your own treatment plan.
Robin Lindquist Grants.
So I think I'm going to jump in here since we're running out of time and just show the last few slides.
High Fidelity Wraparound, National Wraparound Initiative, nwi.pdx.edu, Wraparound Evaluation and Research Team, depts.washington.edu/wrapaval/content/home, a report, Wraparound for Older Youth and Young Adults by J.S. Walker and C. Baird, 2019.
Report that was put out about using wraparound with an older youth population. So we provided that resource here for you. Next slide.
The YARH project page.
This is a screenshot and the full URL for the YARH project page on the OPRE website. This page will give you an overview of the YARH work, and it's actually pretty easy to find if you just search for OPRE and YARH as well. On the project page, you'll find a range of products. ACF and Mathematica have the traditional long report, and then there are also briefs with shorter products and created to share findings or insights on a single topic. So some of the briefs focus on main themes of the process study that was conducted, and then others address a topic that may be of interest to the field, such as youth engagement. And lastly, there are lessons learned briefs, which provide grantees' perspectives on a particular task or topic.
For more information, for
Next
Watch
slide.
Me Rise questions, Victoria Ackman,
So finally,
Vakman at
feel free to contact
FYS.org,
us. I know
Robin
there were a lot of
Lindquist
questions we
Grants,
didn't get to
Linkern
answer,
at
but we're happy to answer
UC.edu.
more
For
beyond
general
today.
YAR questions, Mary
So if you
Mugenborg,
have questions about the
Mary.Mugenborg
program
at
or the evaluation study, we're listed
acf.hhs.gov,
here, and then
Catherine
also
Heath,
contact
Catherine.Heath at
information for OERE and the
acf.hhs.gov,
Children's
K.
Bureau,
Bradley,
Bureau, and
C. Bradley at
Mathematica, general YARH questions.
mathematica-npr.com.
And I'll send it to you, Jen, to wrap us up.
Jen.
Great. Thank you, Robin. I wanted to thank the entire Lighthouse team for this great presentation today. Thank you to Catherine Heath and Jen Schaefer from the Children's Bureau. That is it for this in our series. Thank you for all who attended as well. Thank you for sending us in questions. As a reminder, we will be providing the materials from today's presentation to you within a couple of days of this event. But if you want to make sure that you're always staying up to date about the latest information and news coming from the Youth at Risk of Homelessness grantees and similar work, please subscribe. Our team's going to put the link to subscribe in the chat, and it'll also be included in this PowerPoint that we send out. That way you can stay up to date as new materials become available. I also want to mention that we do have 2 more webinars in our series, the next being on April 27th. So be on lookout for a invitation to register. Thanks everyone. Hope you have a great rest of your day.
Child Welfare Information Gateway, Children's Bureau.